She's the disappointment of this family. That's what my father said. Not in private, not in some quiet argument in the kitchen where these things usually get said and then quietly regretted. He said it standing at a podium in front of 200 people at my little sister's wedding. And the man who stood up next and looked my father dead in the eye was a four-star general. Shack it. My name is Captain Kate Doyle, United States Army. And I want to tell you about the night I found out my father had spent 15 years being ashamed of me, and the night 3 hours later when I found out exactly how wrong he was. N- Let me back up because you need to understand my family before any of this makes sense. I remember an afternoon from when I was maybe 10 years old at a school science fair, standing next to a baking soda volcano I'd spent 3 weeks building in the garage. I'd won second place in my grade, which felt enormous to me at the time. My father showed up late, having come straight from the courthouse, and spent most of the 20 minutes he had reading over Michael's homework at the kitchen counter, since Michael had a test the next day. He glanced at my volcano, said, "Very nice, Kay," and asked if I'd seen where he put his car keys. That's the whole memory. It isn't dramatic. It's just the shape of 100 smaller moments, just like it, stacked up over years until the shape became the whole picture. The Doyles have been lawyers in this country for 4 generations. My great-grandfather argued cases in front of the Ohio Supreme Court. My grandfather was a federal prosecutor. My father, Robert Doyle, sat on a federal bench for 11 years before he retired to a very comfortable private practice, the kind where partners have their names on the letterhead in gold. My older brother Michael became a cardiac surgeon, which my father liked to describe as close enough to law that we forgive him. My younger sister Lauren went to law school the way some kids go to summer camp. Expected, easy, exactly on schedule. She made partner at 29. And then there was me. I was supposed to be a lawyer too. That was never a question in my house, not really a choice so much as a weather pattern everyone just assumed would keep happening. I did the pre-law track in college. I took the practice LSAT twice. I was good at it, honestly. Good enough that nobody in my family understood at all what happened during my junior year. What happened was an ROTC recruiter set up a table outside the student union on a Tuesday I almost didn't walk past. I don't have some dramatic story about why I stopped and talked to him. I wasn't running from anything. I didn't have some tragic thing happen that sent me looking for purpose in a uniform, the way it goes in the movies. I just talked to him for 20 minutes and something about what he described, the structure, the mission. The idea that you could measure a day by whether you'd actually done something that mattered clicked into place in a way 4 years of pre-law never had. I went home that semester and sat in on 2 of my father's old cases, transcripts he kept bound in leather in his study, thinking maybe I just needed to remind myself why the family had chosen this path for 4 generations. I read through a contract dispute that took 11 months to resolve and made 2 law firms a great deal of money and changed, as far as I could tell, almost nothing about anyone's actual life. I'm not saying that to insult the law. Plenty of it matters enormously. I'm just telling you what I felt sitting in that study, and it wasn't the click I'd felt at that folding table outside the student union. I told my father over Thanksgiving dinner that I was switching my commission track, that I intended to go into the Army after graduation instead of law school. I had never, in 31 years of being his daughter, seen his face go that still. Chi didn't yell. That's not really his style. My father does something worse than yelling if you've never experienced it. He goes quiet and polite and slightly formal, the way he probably was in his own courtroom right before handing down a sentence. He asked me if I understood what I was giving up. He asked if this was some kind of phase. He asked, and I remembered a specific sentence because it never left me. Do you have any idea what people will think when the Doyle girl who could have gone to law school decides to go be a soldier instead? Not be safe. Not I'm worried about you. What people will think. My mother didn't say much that night. She never really does when my father's decided how a conversation is going to go. She just squeezed my hand under the table once. Quick, like a secret. I commissioned as a second lieutenant 2 years later. My father did not come to the ceremony. He said there was a scheduling conflict, a deposition he couldn't move. My mother came. Michael came, between surgeries. Lauren was in her second year of law school and sent a card. I remember standing at that ceremony in a gymnasium that smelled like floor wax, scanning the small crowd of families for a face that wasn't there and telling myself it didn't matter. It mattered plenty. I just got good over the years at telling myself things that weren't true when the truth was inconvenient. I suppose I learned that particular skill from my father, if I'm honest about where it came from. That set the pattern for the next 12 years, more or less. Anything Michael did got announced at every family dinner like breaking news. A successful surgery, a promotion, an article in some medical journal. Anything Lauren did got the same treatment. Law review, partnership track, a big settlement she'd helped to negotiate. Anything I did got a polite nod and a change of subject. Oh, I remember one Christmas, maybe 6 years in, when Michael described a 12-hour surgery in enough detail that the whole table sat rapt for 20 minutes, my father asking follow-up questions like he was cross-examining a star witness. When it came around to me, someone asked what I'd been up to, and I mentioned I'd just gotten back from an assignment overseas. My father asked without looking up from his plate, "Logistics again?" I said something close enough to yes, and the conversation moved on to Lauren's bar exam results within about 10 seconds. There was a bar association dinner a couple years after that my father insisted the whole family attend, a black tie thing full of judges and prominent attorneys from across the state. He introduced Michael as my son, the surgeon, and Lauren as my daughter, already making partner track to a small cluster of his colleagues. When one of them turned to me and asked what I did, my father answered before I could open my mouth. "Kate's in the army," he said, in the exact tone he might have used to explain a slightly embarrassing medical condition. Nobody asked a follow-up question. The conversation simply moved on the way conversations do when everyone in the circle has silently agreed not to linger on something. I want to be fair to my father here because I've had a lot of years to think about this, and it's not quite as simple as him just being cruel. I think, in his mind, the law was the family's whole identity, going back 4 generations, and me choosing something else felt like a rejection of all of it. Understanding why he felt that way doesn't make the way he acted on it hurt any less. Both things can be true at once. There's a hallway in my parents' house lined with framed photographs and certificates. Michael's medical school diploma, a photo of him in scrubs after his first solo surgery, Lauren's law review certificate, a photo of her being sworn in as a member of the state bar. My father added a new frame to that hallway every couple of years, like clockwork. There's exactly one photograph of me on that wall, from my commissioning, the one ceremony out of a dozen milestones that happened to fall on a weekend my father wasn't traveling. It's positioned at the end of the hallway, near the coat closet, where the hall lighting doesn't quite reach. I noticed that detail the first time I visited after making captain, and I've never quite been able to unnotice it since. Here's the part that made all of this so much harder to sit with, though, and it's the part most of my family never understood, because they couldn't. Almost everything I actually did in the army, they had no way of knowing about. I didn't go into a combat arms branch, the kind you can describe at a dinner party without a security clearance getting involved. I went into military intelligence, and within a few years, I was working alongside special operations units on assignments that I legally could not discuss with anyone outside a very short list of cleared personnel. Not my father, not my mother, not my siblings. When people asked what I did, I got very good at saying logistics and planning support and other true but deeply incomplete sentences that made my actual job sound like scheduling meetings. My father heard logistics for over a decade, and as far as I could tell, filed it away as further proof that I'd traded a real career for something vague and beneath the family name. I couldn't correct him, not because I didn't want to, because I legally couldn't. My mother knew a little more than the rest of them over the years, though not much. She'd call me on the anniversary of deployments she couldn't quite keep straight, just to say she was thinking of me. Once, after a particularly bad Christmas dinner, she followed me up to my car and told me quietly that she knew I was doing something important, even if she couldn't understand exactly what, and even if she wasn't brave enough yet to say so at the table in front of my father. I loved her for that, and I resented her for it too, in ways I'm not entirely proud of. Knowing quietly isn't the same as saying something out loud when it matters. I understand better now, watching my own soldiers navigate difficult chains of command, how hard it can be to speak up against someone who's used to being obeyed. That understanding came slowly, though. For a long time, her silence just felt like one more vote against me, cast by someone who could have voted differently. There was a night in a valley in eastern Afghanistan 4 years before this wedding that I still can't tell you very much about, even now. What I can tell you is that a Black Hawk went down during a night extraction after an operation had gone sideways in ways that operations sometimes do, and that 4 Americans were on the ground in territory that was actively, violently unfriendly to them, and that I was part of the small team that went back in to get them out. I remember the radio traffic that night more clearly than I remember most of my own life, honestly. The specific static cut quality of a voice trying to stay calm while reporting something that isn't calm at all. I remember making a call based on intelligence I'd spent the previous 6 weeks building about which route into that valley was least likely to get the recovery team killed before they ever reached the crash site. I remember being wrong about part of it and having to adjust in real time, on foot, with 2 other people whose names I still can't say out loud in most rooms. I can tell you it took 11 hours. I can tell you 2 of the 4 men we recovered would not have survived the 12th. I can tell you that I carried one of them myself for almost 40 minutes when his leg gave out completely, and that I don't remember deciding to do that, the way you don't remember deciding to catch something falling toward you. Your body just does it before the thinking part of your brain finishes a sentence. I can tell you that the general commanding that operation personally reviewed the after action report, personally recommended 2 of us for the Silver Star, and personally told me, standing in a dusty command tent at 4 in the morning, that he would remember my name for the rest of his career. One of the men we brought out that night, a young specialist named Danny Osei, still sends me a card every year on the anniversary. Just a few lines, usually. How his kids are doing. That he's grateful he got to watch them grow up at all. I keep every one of those cards in the same drawer where I keep very little else. My family never knew Danny Osei's name or that he existed, or that somewhere out there a stranger measured his whole life against 11 hours my family assumed was just another vague overseas assignment. I finally met his family in person about a year before Lauren's wedding, at a reunion some of the guys from that deployment organized outside Fort Campbell. Denny's daughter was maybe 6 by then, missing a couple of teeth the same way my niece was around that age, and she ran straight up to me at the barbecue without any hesitation, because her father had apparently told her more than once that I was the reason he got to be her dad at all. She hugged my leg for a solid 10 seconds before running off again, entirely unaware of what she'd just handed me. Danny just looked at me from across the yard and nodded, the same kind of nod General Hale would give me across a wedding reception a year later. I understood it exactly the same way both times. His name was General Marcus Hale. There were harder years before that night, too, ones nobody at that wedding would ever hear about either. My second deployment, I broke my ankle badly enough during a training exercise that a medical board nearly ended my career before it had properly started, and I spent 4 months relearning how to run without a limp, alone in the physical therapy gym at 5 in the morning because I couldn't stand the idea of my father hearing, secondhand, that I'd washed out over an injury. There was a stretch, my 6th year in, when I lost 2 people I'd trained alongside within the same 8 months. And I remember calling my mother from an airport, unable to explain why I sounded the way I sounded, because explaining would have meant explaining everything else too. None of that ever made it into a Thanksgiving dinner conversation. It couldn't. And even the parts that legally could have been told, I mostly didn't bother telling anymore, after enough years of watching my father's eyes glaze over at the word logistics. You stop offering people a door once they've shown you, often enough, that they're not going to walk through it. There was one stretch around year 8 when I seriously considered separating from the Army entirely. I'd been passed over for an assignment I badly wanted. I was exhausted in the specific way that comes from years of not being able to talk honestly to the people who were supposed to know you best. And I remember sitting in my car in a parking lot outside a battalion headquarters, genuinely unsure whether any of it was worth the cost anymore. A senior warrant officer I worked with, a woman named Chief Alvarez, who'd been in 22 years by then, found me out there and just sat with me for a while without asking what was wrong. Eventually, she asked one question. Doyle, are you doing this because it's who you are? Or because you're trying to prove something to somebody who isn't even watching? I didn't have a clean answer for her that night. It took me another year or so to realize the honest answer was probably both, and that the second half of that answer was the part I needed to let go of if I wanted to keep doing this job for the right reasons. I stayed in. I'm glad I did. but I don't want to pretend it was some easy, obvious choice the whole way through. Chief Alvarez retired the year before Lauren's wedding, and I called her the week after, mostly just to tell her what had happened in that garden. She laughed for a good 10 seconds before she managed to say anything. Doyle? She finally said, I always told you the right people would figure it out eventually. I didn't expect it to happen with 200 lawyers as witnesses, but I'll take it. I told her I would too. Hap. I didn't know, walking into my sister's wedding 4 years later, that General Marcus Hale was about to become my sister's father-in-law. Hab. Lauren had been dating a man named David for about 2 years by then. I'd met him exactly twice. Once at a family Christmas I'd flown in for on a short leave, once at their engagement dinner, which I'd also barely made it to, landing straight from an assignment I couldn't discuss and changing out of my uniform in an airport bathroom. I knew David's father was in the military, pretty senior, because that's the sentence Lauren used, the same vague shorthand I'd spent my whole career using about my own job. I did not know his father's actual rank. Nobody had ever said the name Marcus Hale to me in the context of my sister's wedding, and if they had, I might have put it together sooner. But military circles are large, and I'd assumed, if I thought about it at all, that it was just a coincidence of last names. I'd actually met him briefly at the rehearsal dinner the night before, though met is generous. We shook hands in a receiving line of maybe 30 people, and someone introduced him simply as David's dad, retired Army, which in a room full of lawyers and doctors registered as roughly the same amount of information as David's dad works in insurance. I remember thinking he had a firm handshake and kind eyes, and nothing more specific than that. I certainly didn't clock the name properly, not against the one I'd heard once in a dusty command tent 4 years earlier from a man I never expected to cross paths with again outside a deployment. I found out how wrong that assumption was about 4 hours into the reception. I'd almost skipped the wedding entirely, if I'm being honest with you. Not because I didn't love Lauren, I did, and do. But I'd spent enough years standing on the edges of family events, watching my father work a room full of judges and partners while I got introduced, if I got introduced at all, as our other daughter, that some tired, protective part of me had started wondering whether it was worth the airfare and the leave request and the 3 days of feeling smaller than I actually was. I went anyway because Lauren asked me herself on the phone in a voice that made it clear she genuinely wanted her sister there, not just a Doyle-shaped placeholder in the family photos. I'm glad I went. I want to say that clearly because for a while afterwards, some part of me wondered whether I would have been better off staying away and skipping the whole evening. I don't think that anymore, but I understand why for a while I did. I remember getting dressed in my hotel room that afternoon, pinning my ribbons on in the mirror the way I'd done for 100 formal events, checking and rechecking that everything sat exactly level the way it's supposed to. It's a strange kind of armor, a dress uniform. It tells a very specific, very true story about who you are and what you've done. And yet I'd learned, over enough family dinners, that it could sit on my shoulders in a room full of my own relatives and communicate almost nothing to them at all. I remember looking at myself in that mirror and wondering, not for the first time, whether tonight would be any different. Davik. The wedding itself was beautiful, if I'm being fair to Lauren, who deserves that much from this story. A big estate outside the city, string lights, nearly 200 guests, most of them my father's colleagues from 30 years on the bench and in private practice. Judges, senior partners. A sitting congressman who'd clerked for my father decades earlier. I came in my dress uniform because I was proud of it, even if nobody in that room particularly wanted me to be. I got the reaction I usually got walking into rooms full of my father's friends. A few curious glances at the uniform, a couple of polite, slightly confused questions from people who clearly didn't know what to do with a Doyle who wasn't wearing a suit that cost more than my monthly housing allowance. One of my father's old law partners asked me, with what I think he genuinely believed was kindness, whether I was still in the reserves or whatnot. I told him active duty, 12 years now. He nodded like I'd told him about a hobby. I remember my father's face when I walked in. Not anger. Something more like resignation. The look of a man bracing for one more evening of managing a fact about his family he'd rather nobody noticed. The toasts started after dinner. I remember feeling a familiar tightness in my chest as the best man tapped his glass, the same low-grade bracing I've carried into every family event for over a decade. half hoping this time would be different and half already rehearsing the polite exit I always kept ready just in case it wasn't. Michael went first, charming and easy, the kind of toast that gets exactly the right laugh at exactly the right moment, because he's had 31 years of practice being the golden child in rooms like this one. Then my father stood up. He talked about Lauren's childhood, about her determination, about watching her grow into one of the finest legal minds of her generation, which got a warm laugh and a round of applause from a room full of lawyers who genuinely believed it. He talked about David, about the Hale family's service to the country, about how proud he was to be joining their families together. And then somebody, I don't even know who, some distant cousin near the back, half a glass of wine into a friendly question, called out, "What about Kate? Any words for your other daughter, Robert?" I watched my father's face do something I'd seen 100 times at 100 smaller dinners, but never in front of 200 people. A tight, practiced little smile. The kind that means he's about to say something he's decided is simply honest rather than something cruel, because in his mind, those are different things. Kate, he said, chose a different path than the rest of this family. We've made our peace with it. He paused, and I think he meant to stop there. I think if he'd stopped there, none of the rest of this happens. But he didn't stop. She's the disappointment of this family, he said, with that same tight smile, like it was a joke, like the whole room would laugh along with him the way they'd laughed about Lauren's determination 2 minutes earlier. But we love her anyway. Cheb, nobody laughed. I want you to understand what 200 lawyers and judges sitting in silence actually sounds like. It's a specific kind of quiet. The kind where you can hear ice shifting in glasses 3 tables away. I sat there in my dress uniform, in a room full of my father's entire professional life, and felt something I hadn't felt since I was 19 years old, telling him I wasn't going to law school. Not surprised, exactly. I'd absorbed versions of the sentence from him for 15 years. What I felt was a specific, familiar humiliation of hearing it said out loud on a microphone to an audience, instead of just implied at a dinner table where at least only family had to witness it. I was already halfway to standing up, already planning the quiet, dignified exit I'd rehearsed in my head 100 times for a moment, exactly like this one, when a chair scraped back at the head table. Steer, scraped back at the head table. I hadn't even fully registered until that exact second that the tall, silver-haired man 3 seats down from David, the one I'd shaken hands with briefly during the receiving line and thought nothing more of, was the same Marcus Hale who'd stood in a dusty tent in Afghanistan 4 years earlier and told me he'd remember my name. He was in his dress uniform, too. 4 stars on each shoulder. And when he stood up, the whole room's attention shifted to him instantly, the way a room full of powerful people always instinctively reorganizes itself around whoever actually outranks everyone else in it. "Robert," he said, and his voice was calm, almost gentle, the way I imagine he must have sounded giving orders in situations far more serious than a wedding reception. "I don't believe we've had the chance to speak much tonight, but I think there's something you should know about your daughter before this evening goes any further." My father's smile was still frozen on his face, the particular kind of frozen that happens when a man realizes half a second too late that he's misjudged the room entirely. "Captain Doyle and I have worked together," General Hale said. 4 years ago, in a valley I'm not going to name, in a room full of civilians, a helicopter went down carrying 4 of our people, in territory where the enemy would have very much liked to make an example of them. He paused. I remember the exact silence in that room. 200 people who spent their careers in courtrooms suddenly listening the way a jury listens to the one witness who actually changes everything. I caught sight of the congressman at table 3, the one who'd clerked for my father decades earlier, leaning forward slightly, his wine glass forgotten halfway to his mouth. A judge 2 tables over had gone completely still, the particular stillness of someone recalculating everything they thought they understood about a case they'd already decided the outcome of. "Your daughter volunteered to be part of the team that went back in to get them," he said. 11 hours, on the ground, in conditions I am not going to describe in detail, at your other daughter's wedding, except to say that 2 of the 4 men we brought home would not have survived a 12th hour out there. I watched my father's face. I want to describe it honestly because I think about it a lot. It wasn't shame exactly, not yet. It was closer to a man trying to do math very quickly in his head, trying to reconcile 15 years of a story he'd told himself about his daughter's vague career with a sentence that had just been spoken out loud by a four-star general at his younger daughter's wedding. I recommended Captain Doyle for the Silver Star personally, General Hale continued. I pinned it on her myself 6 months later at a ceremony her family did not attend. That last part wasn't an accident. I want to be honest about that too. He knew exactly what he was saying and exactly who needed to hear it. I remember that ceremony better than I remember most of the good days in my life, honestly. I'd send the invitation to my parents 6 weeks in advance, printed on actual cardstock, the kind of formal thing I almost never bothered with. My father had a trial that conflicted. My mother said she'd try and then didn't, and called afterward to say she was sorry that something had come up with Lauren's law school orientation she hadn't wanted to miss. I stood in a row of soldiers whose families had all flown in from all over the country, and I was the only one in that row without a single face in the crowd that belonged to me. Huh, General Hale noticed. I don't know how exactly in a room full of 200 soldiers and their families, but generals notice things like that. He mentioned it to me once, years later, almost in passing, that he'd looked out at that crowd and clocked the one empty space where a family should have been standing. I've had the privilege of serving this country for 38 years, General Hale said, turning slightly now to address the whole room, not just my father. I have stood in rooms with senators and secretaries of defense. I have commanded thousands of soldiers across 4 different conflicts. He looked back at my father. And in all that time, Robert, I have met very few people I would trust the way I trust Captain Doyle. So when I hear the word disappointment used to describe her in this room tonight, I find I have to say something because I don't believe it's true. And I don't believe you actually know enough about what she's done to have earned the right to say it. Mm-mm. I don't think I breathed for that entire minute. I remember scanning the room and seeing, of all people, the congressman lean over to his wife and whisper something and her hand come up to cover her mouth. I remember a judge 2 tables over set down his fork entirely, like the meal had simply stopped mattering. 200 people who had spent their careers being very difficult to surprise looked, for one long suspended moment, like they'd forgotten how their own faces were supposed to arrange themselves. My father sat back down without saying anything else. I remember Lauren in her wedding dress staring at me from the head table with an expression I'd never seen on her before. Not embarrassment for our father exactly, but something closer to a lifetime of assumptions rearranging themselves all at once. My mother was crying, quietly the way she does everything, dabbing at her eyes with a cocktail napkin, but crying in a way I understood immediately wasn't about the awkwardness of the moment. It was relief. 15 years of watching her husband dismiss her daughter finally publicly, corrected by someone with enough standing in that room that nobody could wave it away as bias or sisterly loyalty. General Hale sat back down too, gave me a small, private nod across the room. The kind of nod that said everything he wasn't going to say out loud twice in one evening. My mother found me before Lauren did, actually, slipping away from the head table while my father sat frozen in his seat. She didn't say much. My mother rarely does. But she held both my hands in hers and just looked at me for a long moment, her eyes still wet. 15 years, she finally said, quietly, almost to herself. I should have said something 15 years ago. I told her I understood why she hadn't, and that I wasn't interested in relitigating the past on Lauren's wedding night. She squeezed my hands once, hard, and said only, "I'm going to say something now, though, starting tonight." I believed her. And she has mostly, in the 2 years since. Small things, mostly. A willingness to correct my father gently at dinner when he slips into old habits. A phone call every few months just to ask a real question about my actual work. The band mercifully started playing again about 30 seconds later. Someone's quick thinking, probably, realizing the room needed somewhere to put all that silence. Lauren found me near the bar about 20 minutes later, still in her wedding dress, holding it up slightly so it wouldn't drag through the grass on the terrace. She didn't say anything for a moment, just stood next to me looking out at the same string lights our father had been staring at earlier. "I didn't know either," she finally said. "Any of it. I always just figured you were doing something boring and wouldn't talk about it because you didn't want to explain it to us." I told her that was, in fairness, exactly what I'd wanted her to think for a long time. It was easier than the alternative. I've spent 15 years assuming I was the one who did things right, she said. And you were the one who wandered off and did something Dad couldn't brag about at dinner parties. I don't know what to do with tonight. She looked at me, and there was something almost like an apology in it, though she never quite said the word outright. I'm sorry I never asked you a real question about any of it. I just followed Dad's lead, the same as always. I told her it wasn't her wedding to spend apologizing on, and that we'd have plenty of time to actually talk once she got back from her honeymoon. She laughed for the first time all night, a real laugh, and hugged me carefully so she wouldn't wrinkle either of our outfits. Michael found me a little later, drink in hand, looking more uncomfortable than I'd ever seen my brother look in his life, which is saying something for a man who spends his days with his hands inside other people's chests. I always just thought you liked the structure, he said. The army thing. I never thought you were doing anything like what that general described. He shook his head slowly. 11 hours. Kate, I don't know what to say to that. I told him he didn't have to say anything, that I hadn't told this story for the drama of it, and I wasn't going to start now just because it had finally come out into the open at someone else's wedding. He nodded, and then, a little awkwardly, in the way brothers sometimes manage affection they've never quite practiced saying out loud, he said, I'm proud of you. I should have said that a long time before tonight. It wasn't a long conversation. It didn't need to be. Sometimes the shortest sentences carry the most weight. David found me too, still in his tux, looking half mortified and half relieved, the way a groom looks when a chapter of his own family life has just collided, unexpectedly, with his new in-laws. He apologized a little for his father hijacking part of the reception, though I told him there was nothing to apologize for. Then he told me something I hadn't known, that his father almost never talked about specific missions at home, ever, out of habit as much as anything classified, and that David had never once heard him name a soldier by rank and story, the way he'd just named me in front of 200 strangers. He doesn't do that, David said, shaking his head slightly. I've known him my whole life, and I don't think I've ever heard him do that. I told him I understood exactly why that mattered, better than almost anyone else in that garden could have. I didn't stay at the reception much longer after that, not because I was angry, though I was, in a slow-burning way that took weeks to fully process. Mostly because I didn't know what to do with 200 people suddenly looking at me differently, when for 15 years I'd built an entire relationship with my own family around nobody looking at me at all. On my way out, I passed two of my father's old law partners near the coat check, and I overheard one of them say to the other in a low voice clearly not meant to carry, I've known Robert 25 years. Never had the faintest idea. The other one just shook his head and said something about how you truly never know people, even the ones you think you know best. I didn't stop to correct them or explain further. I just let it sit there in the air behind me as I walked out to my car. I found my father out on the terrace around 10 o'clock, alone, looking out at the string lights over the garden. He didn't turn around right away when I came up beside him. The garden had mostly emptied out by then, string lights swaying slightly in a breeze that had picked up sometime after the toasts. And for a moment, neither of us said anything at all. I remember thinking how strange it was, standing next to my father in near silence, when for 15 years silence between us had usually meant something was being carefully avoided rather than simply shared. I didn't know, he finally said. Just that, 3 words, which from my father is practically a full confession. Shevik. I told him he hadn't known because I wasn't allowed to tell him. That most of what I'd done for the last decade had been classified, and that the logistics and planning support he'd heard for 15 years wasn't me being vague to protect some fragile ego. It was the truth, legally filtered down to the only sentence I was permitted to say out loud at a family dinner. I told him that not knowing wasn't really the part that hurt. Then what was? He asked. I told him that even not knowing any of that, he'd still decided 15 years ago that whatever I'd chosen instead of law school was automatically less than what Michael and Lauren had chosen. That he'd never once asked me a real question about my life that wasn't really just a disguised complaint about the life I hadn't picked. He was quiet for a long time after that. Long enough that I almost walked back inside. Your grandfather used to say something to me, he said eventually. That the Doyle name meant something because of the law. 4 generations of it. I think I spent so long believing that I never stopped to ask whether it was actually true or whether it was just the only story I knew how to tell myself about why any of us mattered. He was quiet for a moment, turning his glass slowly in his hand. My father wasn't an easy man to please either, you know. I don't think I ever told you that. I spent most of my 20s trying to be exactly what he expected, and I think somewhere along the way, I decided the only way to prove it had been worth it was to expect the same thing from all three of you. He shook his head slightly. That's not an excuse. I want to be clear about that. It's just the closest thing to an explanation I actually have. He looked at me, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, he actually looked uncertain. My father built a career on never looking uncertain in front of anyone. I'm sorry, Kate, he said. I don't know if that's enough after 15 years, but I am sorry. I told him it wasn't enough. Not yet, but it was a start, and starts matter more than people give them credit for. He asked quietly, almost like he was afraid of the answer, whether I'd tell him about it sometime. Not all of it. He understood, I think for the first time, that some of it legally couldn't be told at all. Just some of it. Enough that he might actually understand what his daughter had spent her career doing, instead of the vague shorthand he built a decade and a half of dismissal on top of. I told him I would. Eventually. Not that night, and not all at once. Some things take longer to hand over than a single conversation on the terrace, even a conversation as overdue as that one was. Things didn't fix themselves overnight. And I want to be honest about that part too, because I think it's the part these stories usually skip over too fast. There was a family dinner about 4 months after the wedding, the first one where all five of us sat at the same table again without a wedding or a holiday forcing the occasion. It was quieter than our dinners used to be, in a good way, less performance, less of my father steering the conversation toward whichever child had the most impressive update that month. At one point, he actually asked me a direct question about my work, something small and specific about how deployments got scheduled, and I watched him actually listen to the answer instead of nodding along on his way to the next topic. It wasn't a dramatic moment. Nobody cried, nobody gave a speech. It was just an ordinary Tuesday dinner where, for the first time in longer than I could remember, I didn't feel like I was performing a smaller, safer version of my life for an audience that had already decided not to be impressed. My father and I are better now, 2 years later. Not perfect. He still occasionally slips into old habits, still sometimes introduces me at events with a slightly too careful description of what I do, still clearly more comfortable talking about Michael's latest surgery or Lauren's latest case than asking me a direct question about my own work. Old patterns don't disappear just because one dramatic evening exposed them. Huh. But he came to my promotion ceremony last spring when I made major. He sat in the second row, next to my mother, and afterward he told a room full of my fellow officers, the actual people I'd spent my career around, that he was proud of his daughter. Not we've made our peace with it, proud. Michael flew in for it too, rearranging 2 surgeries to make the trip, which for my brother is close to a small miracle. Lauren couldn't make it, 7 months pregnant by then and grounded by her doctor from flying, but she sent a video message that played on a laptop at the reception afterward, and my father actually laughed, genuinely, at a joke she made about growing up in my shadow without either of us realizing it. It was such a small, ordinary thing. A room of officers, a laptop propped on a table, my father laughing at his youngest daughter's joke about his oldest daughter. And it meant more to me than almost anything else that whole year. That sentence took him 15 years and one 4-star general to say honestly. I'll take it anyway. I think about General Hale sometimes and what it must have cost him, professionally, to stand up like that at his own son's wedding, correcting the father of the bride in front of 200 of that father's colleagues and friends. It wasn't nothing. Men like my father remember slights like that for a long time, and General Hale knew he was about to become part of this family, whether my father liked how that evening went or not. I asked him about it once, months later, at a dinner where our two families were slowly, awkwardly learning how to actually sit at the same table together. I asked why he'd done it, whether he'd worried about starting his relationship with his son's new in-laws on the wrong foot. He told me something I still think about. He said, Kate, I've spent my whole career watching people get the credit they didn't earn and watching people who actually earned something get overlooked because it was inconvenient for someone else's story. I decided a long time ago that if I ever had the chance to fix one of those moments, I would. Your father's dinner table isn't more important to me than the truth. That wasn't actually the first time he'd said something like it to me, though. Before he left the wedding that night, he'd found me by the parking valet stand, already halfway into a rental car, and told me one more thing I've kept close ever since. I wasn't trying to embarrass your father, Kate, he said. I want you to know that. I was trying to make sure at least one room in this world had the story straight before you walked out of it. I told him he'd more than managed that. He shook my hand the way he must have shaken 1,000 hands over 38 years, firm and brief, and told me to take care of myself in a voice that made it clear he actually intended to remember whether I did. I got a message a while after that story first made its way around from someone I never met, a young man who'd left a stable, respectable job his family had been proud of to become a paramedic instead. He said his own father had said something similar to what mine had once at a family gathering, and that nobody had stood up the way General Hale had. He said reading about that night didn't erase what his own father had said, but it helped him believe, a little more solidly, that the people who dismiss you aren't always right just because they're loud, or because they raised you, or because everyone else at the table stays quiet along with them. I think about him sometimes and about how many people are sitting at dinner tables right now, in families that measure worth by one narrow yardstick, waiting for someone with enough standing in the room to say the thing nobody else will say out loud. Not everyone gets a four-star general at a wedding. But I hope, wherever you are, you find your version of that moment, or you learn to give it to yourself before anyone else does. I don't know if there's a clean lesson at the end of a story like this one, but I've thought about it enough over the past 2 years that I want to try and give you something honest instead of something tidy. I still have that volcano photo somewhere, actually, packed away in a box with the rest of my childhood things. I found it again a few months ago, going through my mother's basement, and I sat on the cold concrete floor for a long time just looking at it. A 10-year-old girl grinning next to a science fair project, with absolutely no idea yet what the next 25 years were going to demand of her, or how long it would take for her own father to actually see her clearly. I don't feel angry looking at that photo anymore. Mostly, I just feel a kind of tenderness toward that kid and a wish that someone could have told her, back then, that the volcano wasn't really the point. She was. Some families measure worth in one very narrow currency, one profession, one kind of success, one story about what the family name is supposed to mean. If you don't fit that currency, it can feel for a long time like you're simply worth less. I spent 15 years believing that, some days more than others. I think about all the versions of me that existed only in rooms my family never entered. The version who carried a wounded soldier for 40 minutes without deciding to. The version who stood in an empty row at her own medal ceremony and told herself it didn't matter. The version who got very good at the word logistics because the real word wasn't allowed out of her mouth. My family only ever met one small, filtered version of who I actually was, and for a long time I let that be enough because it was easier than fighting for the rest of it to be seen. I think about Daniosi's cards too, sitting in that drawer, each one a small, quiet proof that somewhere out there my actual worth had already been measured correctly for years by someone who had every reason to know. I just hadn't let myself count that as evidence because it hadn't come from the people whose opinion I'd spent my whole life organized around. But worth was never actually theirs to measure in the first place. It just took someone else, someone with enough standing in the room saying so out loud before I let myself really believe it. If you're the one in your family who chose the different path, the one that gets the polite nod instead of the toast, the vague description instead of the real one, the quiet dismissal at every dinner table for years running, I want to say this directly to you. You don't need a four-star general to walk into your life and correct the record for your worth to be real. That happened for me, and I'm grateful for it every single day. But it isn't the reason my work mattered. It mattered the whole 11 hours I was doing it, whether or not anyone at that wedding ever found out. I know it's a hard thing to actually believe, on the nights when the people who are supposed to know you best keep getting it wrong. I spent 15 years not quite believing it myself, no matter how many times I told other people some version of this same advice. Knowing a thing and feeling it in your chest at 2 in the morning are two very different exercises. Be patient with yourself while you close that gap. It closes slower than anyone wants it to. Sometimes the truth does show up in a room full of people who need to hear it, And when it does, it's a gift. But don't wait on that gift to know what you already know about yourself. I think if I could go back and say one more thing to that 10-year-old girl at the science fair, it wouldn't be about volcanoes or fathers or 4 generations of lawyers at all. It would just be this: keep building the things that feel true to you, even in rooms where nobody claps, especially in those rooms. The applause, when it finally comes, is nice, but it was never actually the reason the work mattered. Thank you for listening to my story tonight. If it reminded you of your own family, your own dinner table, your own quiet 15 years of being underestimated by people who were supposed to know you best, I'd love to hear about it. You're not alone in it. Even on the nights it feels that way. And if you want more stories like this one, stick around. There's always another one waiting. Take care of each other out there. Good night, everyone.